I'd like to welcome you to Cortland County Historical Society. I'm Tabitha Scoville. I'm the Assistant Director. I'd like to introduce Karen Pastorello. She is a professor at TC3, and Dr. Pastorello currently chairs the Women and Gender Studies program. She earned her PhD in Modern American History from Binghamton University, an MA in American Labor History from Arizona State University, and a BA in History and Education from St. John Fisher College. She's taught at Tompkins Cortland Community College since 1986, I think so. And she teaches the American History Survey courses as well as 19th century labor history, U.S. women's history, and women in work. Her interests include progressive era labor history and labor feminism. Thank you for coming, Karen.
Oh, thank you. And Tabitha neglected to tell you the most important part of my career is she was a former student of mine. So it's really nice to be here, and thank you all for coming. I will talk a little bit about my book and the women that were involved in the suffrage movement over the course in New York State of 69 years. And I think the first thing to remember is that what these women suffragists, and the word suffrage means getting the right to vote, and in this case for women, what these women suffragists were trying to do is convince men to recognize the right to vote. So this is kind of where the whole movement's channeled. And it's technical assistance. I came at this from a labor history standpoint. So as Tabitha said, I've always been interested in labor history and women in the workplace in particular. And a lot of these suffragists, no matter what their social class, considered themselves workers. And they were in fact, oh, it's the PowerPoint, go back to go exit out, yeah, and the top one there. Yeah. And I can do that once you get it. Yeah, it should go. So they considered themselves as working women. Even Susan B. Anthony, who was a teacher and came into suffrage after teaching for about 3 years in Cattaraugus, New York. So this is the area that I study, and I decided to study suffragists as workers. I am part of an organization, a fairly local organization called Upstate New York Women's History Organization. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but it's a group of historians, and many of them are also teachers and professors who study women in New York State history. And I met my co-author, Susan Goodyear. I can't take credit for writing the book myself. We shared the writing. We would meet. We met at one of the conferences for the Upstate New York Women's History Organization, and we became friends, and we decided Susan had written a book on anti-suffrage in New York State. So we thought we were kind of a good pair. I was interested in suffrage, she was interested in anti-suffrage, and we ended up writing this book together. And it was really a collaboration. What we would do is meet just about every weekend in Oneonta. She teaches at SUNY Oneonta, and she set up an office so we could write, and we ended up working on almost every single page together and rereading it at least 2 or 3 times before the book came out. So anyway, why write this book, Women Will Vote? Well, interestingly enough, the suffrage story in New York State has been told, but for the most part, it concentrates on what happens in Seneca Falls, and maybe, if we're lucky, on the victory, but kind of the whole scope in between roughly 1848 and 1917 has never been told, you know, in its entirety. So we decided to approach this in a way that we're looking at a number of groups who begin to come together in a coalition over 3 generations of women it takes, and they start actually before Seneca Falls. Women are thinking about getting rights because they own property, and once they marry, that property automatically transfers to their husband, even in New York State until 1848. That begins to change. But these women are being asked to pay taxes on property that they're now, after 1848, allowed to retain, and yet they have no political rights. They have no right to vote, no right to help set tax policies or anything like that. So they come at it from a property standpoint. They also, some of them are teachers, and they want to take a role in school boards. So they also begin to come at it from that aspect. But there's a group, I think most people are somewhat familiar with this story. There's a group of 5 women, most of them Quakers, who in the summer of 1848, led by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, decide to hold a women's rights convention in Seneca Falls to discuss the ways in which women are oppressed and discriminated against. And they advertise in all the local papers across New York State, and they end up with about 300 attendees, not just women, but men as well. And Frederick Douglass is actually one of the attendees at Seneca Falls. And of course, out of that convention comes the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, and it will be from that declaration, which is modeled after the Declaration of Independence, that we begin to see the formal request for suffrage. So when we talk about Seneca Falls, it doesn't begin or obviously end in Seneca Falls, but that marks the beginning of the first formal movement towards women getting the right to vote. Another thing we need to be aware of, and this is where Susan and I really wanted to have our focus, is that it is not just what we call now the kind of big name elite leaders that help win suffrage. It is literally tens of thousands of New York women, and of course if we look at the national movement, women across the country that work to win suffrage. And I'll talk a little bit about how they go about winning and why it takes so long. So this is actually a very famous statue now in Seneca Falls, and it's showing us Susan B. Anthony meeting for the first time in 1851 Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she's introduced, or they're introduced by none other than a local personality, Amelia Bloomer. And Amelia's actually, it's a little bit hard to see in this picture, but she's wearing her Bloomer costume. So one of the misconceptions on the part of some people is that Susan B. Anthony was at Seneca Falls, and in fact she wasn't. She doesn't become involved in the women's suffrage movement formally until this meeting in 1851. Her parents were there though, and her father and mother went, and also her sister. So they were in attendance, and she, like a lot of these suffragists, will come from that kind of Quaker reform background. Many of these people come out of the abolitionist movement. So early on, the abolitionist movement in upstate New York and women's suffragists are very closely tied, and a lot of the abolitionists become active, and Frederick Douglass is one example in the suffrage movement. So when we wanted to tell this story, as I said, we wanted to tell it through the lens of these different people who are involved, and I pulled a few of them. Some you may have heard of and others maybe not so much. This is, you might recognize Amelia Bloomer wearing her Bloomer costume, and you can see it a little bit better there. And it is, Tabitha and I were talking before I got started, one of her costumes, I don't think it's this one because the whole thing I remember being dark.
It's not. It didn't belong to her.
Okay, it didn't belong to her. Okay.
Who owned ours.
Okay, thank you. So a costume that was called the Bloomer costume is on exhibit at the New York State Library, right? And it's part of the big suffrage exhibit there. So this is probably a really early photograph, just after the technology to begin to take photographs was available. Amelia was, to I guess some extent you could say, a local personality because she resided for a time in Homer, New York, and of course worked in Seneca Falls and had her press and published the Lily there. So she, of course, is very much a suffragist, and it was risky to wear a Bloomer costume walking down the street anywhere, even in Seneca Falls. These women were known to be stoned or have tomatoes thrown at them or whatever. It's considered extremely radical. Another person, and I'm sure most people here have at least heard of her, that's very instrumental, and she's actually a big name. Of the top 3 early leaders, we have Stanton, Anthony, and this woman, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, although she's not known to the general public very much. And she was, as you can see there, written out of suffrage history. So her name doesn't appear in the same way, or she's not depicted in statues and other kinds of memorabilia, the same way Anthony and Stanton are. Matilda Jocelyn Gage is as important as Stanton and Anthony, if not for a time more important, because she founds the New York State Women's Suffrage Association. Every state that's working towards suffrage has its own association, or associations plural, and the New York State Association is the main association. The records for the New York State Women's Suffrage Association are at Columbia, and we were fortunate enough in 2016 to get a grant so we could go work in the archives there over the summer for a few weeks, and we were able to look at some of the early writings of Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and it's very obvious from the minute books that she founded the organization. She's its first president, and she also was the person who started to encourage the creation of local suffrage clubs, so local groups of women and some men. Some did invite and allow men, and some men did participate, but mostly women who got together in places like Cortland. Cortland had, it was called a Political Equality Club, but it's the same thing as a suffrage club. Ithaca had one, Dryden had one, Groton had two. Groton had Groton and East Groton, Newfield had one. So lots of local, very local ties to Matilda Jocelyn Gage. She's from Fayetteville. And of course, Sally Roche Wagner, who is one of the leading feminists right now in the country, has dedicated her life to recognizing the importance of Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And she's founded the Gage Foundation and has turned her home into a museum and archive in Fayetteville. Another local person that people may or may not have heard of is Harriet May Mills, who's from Syracuse. She's even a little bit more local in that she has connections to Cornell. She's one of the first woman graduates of Cornell University. She's from a fairly wealthy family, and many of these lead suffragists who happen to be presidents of suffrage clubs and so on do tend to come from at least middle, if not upper class families, and they have two things that maybe working class women and African American women don't always have, and that is money so that they can conduct their organizing activities, and time. You know, if you're a working woman even today, it's difficult to be an activist. So anyway, Harriet May Mills is the president of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association from 1910 to 1913, and she's extremely active across upstate New York in forming those suffrage, or now they're being called political equality clubs. And she actually comes to Cortland earlier, before she, actually it's kind of earlier in her career, and she founds, I'm not great with technology, so this is as good as I could get this, as clear as I could get it. But she founds, it's a picture of officers of the Cortland Political Equality Club, which is founded in 1898. And the president of the club is Dr. Lydia Strawbridge, and people that are familiar with local history have probably heard about her. And it says, in April 1898, Harriet May Mills, organizer of the New York State Suffrage Association, visited Cortland and gave a lecture on the subject of the signs of the times. So in other words, Harriet May Mills came to a lot of these local areas from Syracuse. She went to Ithaca as the clubs were getting started and tried to give them, boost their visibility and boost their membership. And Cortland is a fine example. So Harriet May Mills will continue her activism even after she leaves the presidency. But while she's still president, lucky for Harriet, the New York State Suffrage Association, which holds yearly conventions, holds one fairly close to Harriet's home in Ithaca. They rotate across the state annually. And this is actually a program that we found at Columbia University. It's very rare. Some of course, is any historical subject matter. Some of it is kind of lost to the times. This survived. It's one of the rare surviving programs of the 43rd Annual Convention of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association, held at the Baptist Church in Ithaca. And Ithaca's kind of a unique case because we tend to think of Ithaca today anyway as being kind of a progressive place. But in the late 18 and early 1900s, it wasn't so progressive. They were okay talking about temperance or having women talk about temperance and maybe educational subjects, but they were really a little bit opposed to speaking openly about suffrage for quite a while, until a woman named Louisa Lord Riley comes to visit from New Jersey. Her son is actually a student at Cornell in the late 1890s, and I learned this as I was doing this. I guess it was common for parents, upper class parents in particular, instead of allowing their kids to live in the dormitories, which Cornell did have, they would move to Ithaca with their parents or with their children and set up a household so their children could live with them. So they totally transferred the family, and that's what Louisa Lord Riley and her husband did. But the good thing is Louisa Lord Riley had led a suffrage club in Orange, New Jersey, where she was from, and she looked around and she couldn't believe there wasn't one in Ithaca. And again, this is in the late 1890s. So she begins an Ithaca Women's Club. She has a safe name. You know, we don't want to say yet it's political or suffrage oriented, but they do quickly break off and form a branch of what's called the Ithaca Political Study Club that eventually will become a political equality club in Ithaca. And holding the convention, you can see there. This, I'm sorry if it was a little bit bigger, but I'll just tell you why I have this up here, because it's showing not only the program from the 1911 convention in Ithaca, but it's listing a number of the clubs, and you see the Ithaca Club, the Groton Club, the East Groton Club, and some of the people connected to those clubs. So if you wanted to come up maybe after I'm done and take a closer look at those names, and I think, so this is 1911, and of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony have both passed away by now. Stanton dies first in 1902, and Anthony dies in 1906, so neither one of them lived to see the passage of suffrage in New York State. There's one woman who attended the Seneca Falls Convention. She was 18 or 19 at the time, named Charlotte Woodward Pierce. She was a young glove maker in Seneca Falls, and she's the only one we know of that actually lived to see suffrage, the 19th Amendment, actually passed at the national level, but she was too ill to make it to the polls, so she never got to vote. One of the groups we look at, as I alluded to, are especially immigrant working women, and I did my dissertation at Binghamton University on the founder, who was a woman, Bessie Abramovich Hillman, of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. And they did have a union branch in Rochester. And these unionists were also, at the same time, they were striking, fighting for suffrage, because working women across the state saw the vote, or the right to vote, as what they considered a panacea. It would have solved all their problems. And this is in the wake of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. You know, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire kills 146 young, mostly Italian and Jewish immigrant workers, like would be in this picture, because that's the same, those are the same ethnic groups that comprise the Rochester industry. And there's a lot of national exposure. Most people live in rural areas in 1911, even in New York State. So it's the first time those banner headlines expose what's going on in cities, sometimes like Rochester or Troy or Buffalo or New York City, where there's these garment workers who have no minimum wage. They're working extremely long hours, and the Triangle Factory exposes, of course, the unsafe conditions. So after 1911, things begin to change a little bit. There's a little bit more public empathy for these strikers, but that same year, there's a major strike or major fire in Binghamton that people don't know a lot about that kills 36 garment workers in 1913. So the conditions are not solved, but these women will very quickly become part of the suffrage movement. And a lot of times we see women from New York City coming up and talking to the striking workers. Women like Lenora O'Reilly and Rose Schneiderman are two of the well-known names. Also, African American women. This was probably the hardest chapter to write, because the material on working immigrant women is scarce, and on African American women it's almost non-existent when it comes to suffrage and their activity in New York State. There's a woman named Rosalind Turberg Penn who's written kind of the national book on African American women at the national level, kind of just their history, and she has 2 pages in that book on suffrage. And she unfortunately misidentifies 2 of the women she's talking about as being African American when in fact they were actually white. It's very hard to determine race a lot of times. 2 of the more well-known suffragists associated with New York State activism are Harriet Tubman. In this picture, does anyone know the story? Linda, you probably do, of the picture of Harriet Tubman. It was recently discovered. This is one of the only early photographs we know of that exists of Harriet Tubman. There's not a lot of photographs of her, period, but if you see photographs, she's much older in most of them. This was actually in an album belonging to Emily Howland of Sherwood, New York, and I'll tell you a little bit about her in a minute. And when it was discovered, it was like this huge, rare find, and it ends up being auctioned. I think it's the entire album was auctioned for $161,000, and the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress pooled their funds and purchased this photograph of Harriet Tubman. So it went to a good place. Everybody was kind of, holding their breath to see who purchased it, and so now it's in a safe place. But Harriet Tubman is well known for her speaking skills. She's obviously known for her abolitionist activities, and she becomes, after freedom is won, part of the women's suffrage movement and speaks quite often in New York State. The woman on the right is Sarah J.S. Garnett, who was a resident of Brooklyn in the late 18 and early 1900s. She founds the Brooklyn Equal Suffrage Club. It's one of the only organizations we discovered that was working just towards African American women's suffrage. Why? Well, African American women were very active. They had a long activist tradition, but they did not single out their activist groups. In other words, they worked for the entire, the uplift of the entire race. They had so many problems to contend with, ranging anywhere from low wages and domestic servitude to lynching in the South. So they worked against, a lot of their discriminations and prejudice. And Sarah J.S. Garnett is noted not only for her activism in the arena of suffrage, but she becomes the first African American school principal in New York City. So a lot of the African American women who are activists are in fact middle and upper class, and many of them are involved in teaching in the business world. Men are also part of what makes up eventually a pretty sizable coalition of suffragists. And this dapper young man, he's written about in so many terms. They talk about how he's dazzling and he goes and visits college campuses. Max Eastman, his name is. He's a prominent socialist, and he ends up, his sister Crystal Eastman is a member of Heterodoxy, which is a radical working women's club in New York City. And he ends up going to New York City. He's from Corning, actually. He's born in Corning. And he lives in New York City with his sister while he's finishing up college. And he ends up having, literally, the way it's described by him anyway, is a job at Columbia University kind of fall into his lap, a job in the philosophy department. So he's a very young socialist professor. He's very much influenced by John Dewey, the famous philosopher whose wife was a suffragist. And Max is a great example of a male suffragist who comes from a suffrage family. His mother, Annis Ford Eastman of Corning, is one of the first ordained Congregationalist ministers in New York, and she's also a very staunch suffragist. Crystal, his sister, as I mentioned, is a lawyer in Heterodoxy and a suffragist, and Max is kind of drawn into the reform arena. He's recruited to go out and do the organizing of other men in New York City by a man named Oswald Garrison Villard, who's the grandson of the famous William Garrison, or William Lloyd Garrison, I'm sorry, the abolitionist. And the Oswald Garrison publishes the New York Post, and he has lots of money, so he gives it to Max and he says, you go out and you organize the men, and we're going to form what becomes known as the New York Men's League for Women's Suffrage, which comes into existence in 1909. And at first it's mostly middle and upper class professional men. There's a lot of Cornell professors that become part of the organization, men from across the state. They march for the first time in one of the very early suffrage parades. The suffrage parades start in New York in 1910. This is one of the second ones, the second large one anyway. And there's 89 men that end up marching in that parade. They are laughed at and jeered at, and people throw things at them out of windows, and so they're kind of harassed in the same way women 50 years or so earlier were harassed for wearing the bloomer costume. But by the following year, by 1912, they go from roughly this contingent of 89 men to over 500 men. So they do a lot for the women's suffrage cause, in that they lend money, they lend their support, and they lend visibility. You know, to have these prominent bankers and lawyers and professors really helps publicize what's going on with the women's suffrage movement. This is another picture of the parade. This is a 1913 parade, and we used a version of this picture for the cover of our book, but we noticed from reading those signs that the women are holding up that everybody there in the coalition, every group in this coalition, whether it's men or working women or the New York State Women's Suffrage Association, they're all represented with the exception of African American women. They're kind of left out, which is, again, somewhat typical. You notice that the suffragists are wearing white, which is considered a suffrage, representative of suffrage, as is white considered anti-war. And of course, once World War I breaks out, that color will be associated with anti-war. Suffragists also use a lot of yellow. You know, a lot of the National Women's History Museum has a little piece on their website about suffrage colors and what they're representative of. Supposedly the yellow comes from the Kansas movement, the sunflower, but the New Yorkers adopt yellow and also gold. And I should mention this poster too, because one of the things suffragists do to publicize suffrage is they have posters printed, or in this case it's a Buffalo artist named Ellen Carey Rumsey, I think, who paints this, and they call it in the Art Deco style. It was done in 1905, and I was telling Tabitha and a couple other people that were in here early that was appraised, this poster, and it is an original. Nobody walk out with it. It is an original, and it was appraised on the Antique Roadshow years ago now for between $10,000 and $15,000. And it's valuable not only for the suffrage content, but also what they said is that it's 24 karat gold gilding around the border, which helps increase the value. Yeah, so the suffragists, you know, parades and literature and all kinds of stunts. And this picture is a little bit blurry because it came out of a newspaper, but it reads across the bottom, the melting pot, and it's in quotes. Women contribute jewelry to the cause, and the cause is in quotes. So what was going on here is women donated their old or broken or unwanted jewelry, and they put it in this bucket, and supposedly they melted it all down and somehow sold it, probably to a metal dealer or a jeweler, and whatever money they raised, they donated back to the cause. Because that's what women need, is they need not only organization, but they need money to organize. So they did everything from starting out in the early 1830s and 40s. They did some letter writing, they petitioned legislators, they kept doing that right along. They approached political candidates and they would endorse them if the candidates said they were for suffrage. They conducted rallies, they rode in cars and had soapbox speeches. They would just kind of pull up at a corner, maybe an intersection out here, and they would take out a soapbox and climb up on it and just start speaking in support of suffrage and try to attract crowds. They flew planes, or some flew planes. There were actually some pilots that were suffragists, or they hired planes to drop millions, literally millions of pieces of literature out of the planes over the course of the suffrage movement. What they did in rural areas like this, and especially in the outlying farming communities, is they went out in what were called suffrage squadrons, teams of 2 women, and they would knock on the doors of farmers' houses, and usually the farmer and his wife would be there. And they would start to talk about suffrage and what it was and what it would mean to the farmer and his wife if women did in fact get the right to vote. Because although there was an anti-suffrage movement, a pretty vibrant anti-suffrage movement, we find out in New York State, when the referendum failed, there were 2 referendums, one in 1915, which only passed in 6 counties, and Cortland is actually the 6th, but if you do a recount, it ends up failing in Cortland. So, and 22 votes made the difference. You know, where they say your vote doesn't count, it does count in a situation like that. But so who won? It won in Shenango, Schenectady, Schuyler, Broome, and Tompkins. Those are the counties where it won, which are mostly rural counties at the time. But analyzing, what they find out is, hey, immigrant men didn't vote in large numbers, especially immigrant men in New York City. They need to be educated. Farmers in upstate rural areas didn't vote in large numbers. And they find out that they did this canvassing, they did this knocking on doors, but they didn't entirely convince people because they didn't follow it up with education. So they start this huge educational campaign. They make more posters. They have plays and poems and songs, and they market products that have votes for women emblazoned on them. They also do what, this is Jenny Curtis Cannon. She's in the seat next to the driver. And she's from Delhi. Her records, she's, one of the reasons I kind of pulled her out is because her records, at least 2 years of them, survive at Cornell, the records of her activism. She was the 6th district chair. So what happens is New York gets divided up into 12 assembly districts in what's called the Empire State Campaign, working towards that 1915 referendum vote. And Jenny Curtis is the chair of the 6th district, which includes Binghamton and the surrounding counties, including Delhi, or Broome County and Delhi County. And she, you can see here, decks out a car. These are big flower wreaths, and she gets some of her suffrage workers in her car, and they drive around with these banners, and they lead processions, and when they're going to big annual conventions, they form caravans. So they do all kinds of things to attract attention. Another thing that begins to help suffrage move forward in New York State, after that 1915 referendum fails, women suffragists who support the war effort, which were not all of them. Suffragists were kind of divided. Many of them, like Carrie Chapman Catt, were actually pacifists and against the war. But they realized, hey, we at least in some cases have to say we support the war, even though maybe in our own hearts and minds we don't really support it, because we're going to be considered anti-patriotic if we don't speak in favor of the war. So this is Mrs. Lewis Tiffany of the famed Tiffany jeweler. Her real name's Katrina, and that was the other thing that's kind of, or another one of hundreds of things that's interesting, is it's really hard sometimes, no matter how prominent these women are, to find out what their first names are, because they're always going by Mrs. Lewis or whatever. So Katrina, her name is with a K, Katrina Tiffany. And you can see she's all decked out, and you can watch women's fashions change throughout this period, because this will be the transition from the Gibson girl, sometimes they call it the Victorian woman. We don't really have a Victorian period in our country. But anyway, the Gibson girl, drawn by Charles Dana Gibson, with that hourglass figure, wearing corsets with those big poofy buns, to what Katrina is headed towards, and that is kind of a flapper, right? It's funny because the first thing to go is not necessarily the hemline going up or even the sleeves going up, but the very first indication is a V-neck. that the necklines start to go down a little bit, and then the hair gets bobbed, and the hemlines and sleeves do come up. This is another stunt, I guess you could say. A lot of the suffragists, and Harriet May Mills was great, and there's actually a building named after her at the State Fair called the Harriet May Mills Building, because they would set up booths, or in the case of the State Fair in Syracuse, build buildings, so women could be present and show the advancements they made and convince men that they were definitely worthy of the right to vote. And so they have men helping them sell hot dogs at the fair, and this is kind of typical. County fairs, there's lots of surviving records that talk about the Cayuga County Fair in Moravia, and really what they talk about more than anything else is a rainy season and how deep the mud was. This is a woman named Gertrude Foster Brown, who's another big name, kind of elite woman. She's the wife of a big prominent banker in New York City, and she does what lots of other women do, and there's one set up for a short time, a few weeks in 1914 in Ithaca, and that is she's helping to educate what suffrage is all about, because as I started to say, and I probably went off track, men were not opposed to suffrage towards the end of the campaign so much because they didn't want women to vote. They were more opposed to it because they didn't know what it was. You know, they were sometimes even apathetic. So in convincing men, education ends up being the big tool that's used. And what she's doing is she's teaching at a suffrage school, and you can see here it says something about polling places. What the suffragists did in 1915, and they'll do it again in 1917, is they stationed poll watchers at the polls to make sure that things were running legitimately. And if they knew men were going to vote for suffrage, they did what supposedly, I haven't actually seen it happen, even though I was a election inspector for a while, they went and picked those men up and brought them, or made sure they could get a ride to the polls. If they were saying, we're going to vote for suffrage, or I'm going to vote for suffrage, but I can't get there. So that's another thing that they would do. This also is probably one of the major reasons that suffrage does win by 1917. In addition to everything I named, the cars, the banners, the planes, the literature, the plays, all that, these New York State suffrage and political equality clubs become more numerous, more vibrant, and vitally important in casting pro-suffrage ballots. You can see there's concentrations in certain areas. And by the way, Harriet May Mills, when she came into office as the president of the New York State Association in 1910, there were roughly 250 of these clubs. By the time she left in 1913, there were 487. So it goes to show you kind of what coordination can do. We've only found about 200, and since we've written the book, and this is in our book, not all these pictures are, but this one is a map that is constructed purposely for our book. And we've only found about 200 so far, and we know there's many more. And as we go and speak locally, people almost always come up to us and say, you know, there was a suffrage club in East Greenwich, or, you know, whatever it was. So you can see some concentrations down by the city, right? Because the New York State Women's Suffrage Association moves in 1909. Its headquarters had been in Syracuse, in Harriet May Mills' home, which is now the Vera House, a shelter for homeless women. But they moved their headquarters to New York City in 1909, and you see the concentration of suffrage clubs. Long Island, the tip more towards Manhattan, is a hotbed for suffrage, and there's been a book written by a woman named Antonia Petrash on the Long Island suffrage movement. Does anyone know what that county is? How good are people with their geography? The Chautauqua. Yeah, Chautauqua County. And you can see it's the westernmost county of New York State. It's considered by Ann Gordon, who's an authority on suffrage, to have been the best organized county in the entire state. At the time of the suffrage movement, so roughly 1848 to 1917, Chautauqua County was a hub of transportation, a hub of farming, grape farming in particular. It housed the first grange, and grangers become supportive of the suffrage movement, and it housed the first temperance organization in New York State. So it was kind of this activist, progressive place. It was also a place where people traveled through on the way west. You know, think about the westward expansion that's going on during this period. So it was kind of a happening place. The other thing it had was the Chautauqua Institute, which was a center for education and hosted many, many suffrage meetings with some really big name speakers like Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, who was the president of the National Association for a time, and so on. So anyway, this is extremely organized. Rochester, as you might guess, was extremely organized, the home of Susan B. Anthony and her sister Mary Anthony, although Monroe County, which is where Rochester is, never passed the suffrage, not in 1915 and not in 1917. It's a very conservative politically county at that time, and I think still is. The North Country does have a few isolated, that we found anyway, isolated political equality or suffrage clubs, but not many. And those counties tended to not vote for suffrage, those counties that remained unorganized. So victory is won, finally, in 1917. Oh, I forgot I hit this slide. This shows you a few of the different products that were used to advertise suffrage. Shredded wheat, which was introduced first at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, becomes a suffrage endorsed product. This is a banner from a Syracuse convention, one of the annual conventions that was held in 1906 in Syracuse. Ask Santa to bring the vote for mother. There's a poster. I forgot I had that on there. Yeah, so there's a poster. And Sherwood Stone Store Museum actually has an original of that poster as well. Those are the only two I've ever seen. There's a typical New York State Women's Suffrage Party banner. As they move closer to the second referendum, they decide to adopt the style of a major political party, and they go from being an association to calling themselves a party. And last but not least, a paper drinking cup that says votes for women. They also had even radiator caps for cars that said votes for women. So they win in 1917, and it is a great time. Even after the vote goes down in 1915, they don't stop. I think the lesson to learn from these women is resiliency. The question might be, or one of the questions is, why does it take so long? That's an extremely complicated answer. One issue is that the movement, at the national level in particular, is divided from within, and that always slows down a movement. In New York, it took that long to form an effective coalition. One question that you could ask is, what do women do with the vote once they have it? Kind of, so what? Well, the obvious answer is they vote. And this is Emily Howland, who was one of, if not the leading financial contributor to the New York State Women's Suffrage Campaign. In other words, she gave more money than any other one person. There was another woman, Eliza Osborne, in the Auburn area, who was a big contributor as well. Emily Howland has a fascinating history. She lives to be 102. She's from Sherwood, New York, which is a couple miles from Aurora, along the shores of Cayuga Lake there, if you don't remember where that is. And she starts out in a very wealthy family. Her father's a merchant, and this little picture here is now a museum, but it was originally her father's store. And her father makes a lot of money in the mercantile trade, or trading, and owning really what amounts to, I guess you could say, a general store in a very bustling area at the time. And Emily ends up being not only an abolitionist early in her life, but after the Civil War, she goes to the South and helps found, I guess is the word I want, found schools for freed children, newly freed slave children, really, or former slave children. And she then becomes involved when she comes back north, when she's a little bit older, in the suffrage movement. She never marries. She devotes her life to the suffrage cause. And there's a school there was a school in Sherwood, an elementary school named after her. It's now closed in Bacon. It's kind of a sad sight, actually. But Elsie Gutchess, if you know Elsie Gutchess, is opening what's called the Open Door. She intends it to be a library of women's history. I think it's in Emily Sherwood's house. She's purchased Emily Sherwood's house. or Emily Howland, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I have the Sherwood Stone store down there because that's kind of a local site that houses not only posters but all kinds of other suffrage from them. And we have women going to the ballot box in New York, and as I said, that's the obvious thing. So what they're doing is they're voting for measures that are going to affect them. We have women that were part of the New York State legislature pretty early on. Their names that are kind of surfaced only very recently. Very few women, though, serve early. We have around 60 women suffragists that we've identified who, after they win the right to vote in New York State in 1917, went on to the national movement to work. Carrie Chapman Catt is going to be one of those. And they end up picketing the White House. And there's actually a project that's out of Binghamton University, Alexander Street Press, that chronicles the names and biographies of these women. They become part of the National Woman's Party, led by Alice Paul. Many of the New York State women, though, end up founding League of Women Voter chapters, and that's what happens in Ithaca, that's what happens in New York City. And the intention is so that they can educate potential voters and help people that are not yet citizens become citizens. So, unfortunately, the battle doesn't end in 1917. It goes on, obviously, till 1920 and even to today. And I think I'd like to close by saying that these women are inspirational, and we don't know their names. You know, there's literally tens of thousands whose names are lost to history. But what we still need, and what I think most of these women would have supported, maybe not all, are things like subsidized child care, health insurance for all Americans, an end to sexual harassment in the workplace, and last but not least, there's a glimmer of hope here, paid parental leave, because New York State, I think most people realize, just passed paid parental leave policies, and it's going into effect in January of the coming year, 2018. It's not going to cover, you know, all people in all situations, but at least it's a start. You know, it's not perfect, but at least it's a start. So New York becomes, I think, the 6th state to have a paid parental leave policy. And of course, what we hope is, like the suffrage movement, it's passed state by state, and eventually it will be national. So thank you very much, and if you have questions, I'll be glad to answer.
Were there as many suffragette movements in other states surrounding us as you can tell us about what happened in New York State?
I think we counted, and there's something like 30 states that had books written about their suffrage movements before we wrote the New York State book. Yeah, the western states are actually the states that grant women's suffrage first as they come in as states from being territories. So Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and there's one other, Colorado, I think, are the first 4 states that grant suffrage. So New York has the notoriety of being the first state east of the Mississippi to grant full suffrage for women in 1917. In other words, they can vote all the way to the presidency. Yeah, that's kind of our claim to fame. Illinois did grant suffrage, but it wasn't presidential suffrage in 1913.
Oh,
yeah,
some passed it, but you couldn't do.
You couldn't vote for the president. Yeah, it doesn't matter anyway in New York because there's not a presidential election until 1920. So Emily Howland, that's why you saw her going to vote in her first presidential election, because the previous one had been 1916 and she wouldn't have had the right to vote yet. Yeah. That's a good question, though. Yeah.
The good news for Emily Howland is, while they did close her school in Sherwood, the Southern Cuba Elementary School is now called Howland.
Oh, good. So they renamed it.
They
Good.
renamed it.
Okay. Yeah, it's so sad to drive by there and see that school empty.
No, she's got her name still, remember.
Oh, good. Thank you. So I have just...
I wonder, what were the origins of the discrimination against women? Did it start here in America? Did it come over from Europe?
Well,
Were women always discriminated against?
Yeah.
All
The
of the
witchcraft.
above.
Yeah. If we look at even the history of witchcraft, you know, that start in Europe, yes, and it does translate to the to the colonies, actually. the discrimination, legally, if we look at the 14th Amendment, it's the insertion of the word male that kills all the hope of women having their right to vote recognized, because some people argue, constitutional scholars, if you look at the early Constitution, that women's rights were not questioned, they were in there, but when they threw that word male in there, that eliminated their right. Yeah, so it stems at least, and of course Anthony and Stanton had hoped to get a 16th Amendment, right? So the 15th defines citizenship, and then the 14th defines citizenship, and the 15th guarantees the right to vote against, regardless of race, creed, and so on, but you had to be a man. And property requirements are another issue, yeah, that are kind of tangled up in there.
I had seen the picture of that young Harriet Tubman, when it came up for sale and what have you, but I never noticed that someone had written on her dress, Harriet Tubman. I wondered, because she doesn't really look like the Harriet Tubman in the older pictures, so I wondered how they actually identified her and knew who she was.
Yeah, I think it's Emily Howland's writing, somebody surmised, I'm not positive, yeah.
Okay.
Because it was her album, so I don't
It was
know if
her
that's
album
true.
that it
Yeah.
came,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, and they spoke in terms of not knowing how old she was when that picture was taken, not really.
I think they have a question mark for her birth, which is common if you're born into slavery. Yeah, it was sometimes common.
Lucretia Mott came to McGrawville
Oh, she did?
and spoke at a commencement service in 1850, I think. We had a smallpox epidemic, and so we're sure we're going to have a commencement service, and she came.
Oh, nice. Okay.
I would think, I don't know the history of the Cobblestone Church in Cortland, but they were very, very active during that time, both with slavery, anti-slavery, and I would have thought the women's movement also.
Usually they're pretty closely connected. Yeah, these women, what's incredible is the amount of travel they do. I mean, not only the resiliency, but if you look at some of the Quaker writings, they talk about going up and down Cayuga Lake in ferries and catching the railroad to go to Seneca Falls or to go to Rochester. And I said it seems like it was easier to get back and forth in those days, public transportation-wise, than it is now in some ways, yeah. And Susan B. Anthony also visited this area, as did Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan B. Anthony spoke in Ithaca in 1869 at the invitation of Ezra Cornell. And the article is just a teeny paragraph in the Ithaca, one of the Ithaca papers, and it says her talk was poorly attended because people didn't really support suffrage in 1869. And then she came back again, I think, and had a better turnout. But Ezra Cornell was apparently a really early suffragist, which kind of explains why a lot of the professors at his university openly supported it a little later. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome, thank you. I have a couple books if anybody's interested, and postcards if you're interested in thinking about ordering. You can take with ordering information.